Mr. President, I rise today to speak for the millions of Americans impacted by prescription drug abuse, particularly those in my home state of West Virginia, where 600 lives are lost every year to opiates. I believe that the FDA must start taking prescription drug abuse seriously, and this will not happen without a cultural change at the agency. You and I both are taking this basically as a caucus, drug prevention caucus, and opiates, and what it's done to South Carolina, what it's done to West Virginia, and the epidemic effect it's had on all America. We've seen too many examples of the FDA standing in the way of efforts to address the opiate abuse epidemic. If you just look at this chart, you can tell the rise of deaths over the last 15 years and what it has done to our country and to our states. It's unbelievable, unacceptable. Every other epidemic in this country that we've been able to face and cure. This one we don't. We seem to be keeping it out of sight, out of mind. The FDA delayed for years before finally agreeing to reschedule hydrocodone. My first 3 years in the Senate were consumed by getting the FDA to come around on this important step. And since the change went into effect, Mr. President, we've seen the number of prescriptions for combination hydrocodone products such as Vicodin and Lortab fall by 22%. That's over 1 billion pills not being put on the market. And then after finally taking that step, to add insult to injury, what they have done, taken so long for this to be rescheduled from a 3 to a Schedule 2, then the FDA approved the dangerous drug Zohydro, even when its own experts voted 11-2 against approval. The drug has 10 times the hydrocodone of Vicodin and Lortab, and with the capability of killing an individual in just 2 tablets. Can you imagine? And just recently, the FDA outrageously approved OxyContin for the use for children as young as 11-year-olds. This decision means that pharma is now legally allowed to advertise OxyContin to pediatricians under certain circumstances. We've seen this story before. We've seen the devastating impact of this type of advertising, and we have years of evidence that shows that drug use at an early age makes a child more likely to abuse drugs later in life. These decisions by the FDA are horrifying examples of the disconnect between the FDA's actions and the realities of this deadly epidemic. Leaders at the FDA, including the director of the division that oversees opiates, are now actively working against the CDC's effort, the Center for Disease Control, efforts to reform prescribing guidelines, which represents a reasonable, common sense approach to help doctors take into account the very real and prevalent danger of addiction and overdose when prescribing opiates. What we have found out, Mr. President, there's very little education done, and doctors aren't required as they go through medical school. Most of them will tell you they have less than 1 week of schooling for this. That is why last week I announced that I will filibuster any effort to confirm Dr. Robert Califf. This is a good man, stellar reputation, just comes from the wrong end of this crisis that we have to make the change that needs to be made. That's all I have said. Give us someone who's passionate about the change. The change must come from the top of the FDA. We need a cultural overhaul of the FDA. When you have the FDA fighting the CDC, CDC's making recommendations for new guidelines of how they're prescribed, how we should protect the public, and the FDA is taking the position that no, what pharmaceuticals are putting out is something that we need. It's a product. It's a business plan. I'm sorry, Mr. President. I cannot accept that, and I truly believe that it's going to be a cultural change, and that starts at the top. Over the past week, my office has been absolutely flooded with stories from West Virginians who want their voices to be heard. And I said, unless we make this real, unless I can bring to you the real life and the stories and the tragedies that people are enduring because of the prescription abuse that goes on. These letters have come from children who have seen their parents die from an overdose, grandparents who have been forced to raise their grandchildren when their kids went to jail, rehab, and the grave, and teachers and religious leaders who have seen their communities devastated by prescription drug abuse. These people need help from the FDA. They count on this oversight committee, this regulatory committee, the Federal Drug Administration, to do what should be done to protect millions of Americans across the U.S. and also who have been affected. I'm going to read to you a story, Mr. President, and basically bring a person's life into what happens in a daily situation in an abused area. The first story I'd like to read comes from a West Virginian by the name of Haley. Haley lives in Princeton, West Virginia, which is in southern part, and she's a teacher in Beckley, West Virginia. She is married and has a baby who is about to turn 1. Here is her letter. This is Haley's story. Prescription drug addiction destroyed my childhood. Thanks to prescription drug abuse, I grew up much too quickly and still have trust issues today. My mom's one true love was Xanax, and I would always come in second or after that, no matter what. When I was in 5th grade, my mom went to rehab 2 hours away from me. My parents are divorced, and my stepdad worked on the road, so I stayed with my grandparents. We visited my mom on the weekends, and I didn't really understand why she was there. None of it made any sense to me, and I just wanted my mom. One day, we received a phone call stating that she had checked herself out, and we had no idea where she was for about 24 hours. This wasn't the first time my mom had unsuccessfully tried rehab, and it would not be her last. There were times when I would get home from school and have no idea where my mother was, so my grandma and I would have to drive around and search for her. We would eventually find her passed out in one of her friend's house. There's one particular memory that traumatized me and is forever ingrained in my memory. I was 10 years old when we found my mom. She was too high to even walk on her own. My 70-year-old grandmother and I had to virtually carry her to the car. When we got home, I took her shoes off so I could put her in bed. I remember being sick to my stomach with worry when I took off her shoe to find a sock completely soaked with blood. She had apparently stepped on glass and had even felt the cut because she was too high on pain pills. This is something no one, especially an innocent 10-year-old, should have to deal with. My 12th birthday was the worst birthday of my entire life. I was supposed to have a pool party, but my mom did not show up to pay for it, so my 16-year-old sister had to step in. There was no food or drinks because my mom was supposed to handle all that for me. When she finally showed up at the end of my party, equipped with her unbelievable excuses, her eyes were bloodshot and rolled around in her head, I was hurt, but I was mostly embarrassed that people felt so sorry for me. Everyone knew my mom was a drug addict, and everyone always pitied my sister and me for the life we had to live. Yet again, my mother chose her beloved high over me. My mom's battle with drug addiction did not stop there. She went on to rehab again and jail several more times. When she wasn't home, I would search her room and find Xanax, Lortab, oxycodone, and many other unknown pills. Nearby, I would always find cut-up straws or even parts of a tampon applicator. She was creative, to say the least. When I was in 9th grade, my mom went to jail for stealing. She would get super high and then go into stores and steal ridiculous things like hair scrunchies, makeup, and whatever else she could get her hands on. I didn't know she was going to jail until 2 days before she left. She had been depressed and in her bed sick, probably going through withdrawal for several days. She finally told me that she would be going to jail the day after Christmas. Once again, I would be without a mom. She was in jail the remainder of my 9th grade year until the end of my 10th grade year. I don't know how I passed the 9th grade, Mr. President, she said. I failed almost every class except English, and I would have failed that one too if it hadn't been for such an amazing teacher who helped me overcome so much. My mom went to jail for stealing again while I was in college, and my ex-boyfriend had to bail her out of jail. I had a baby via C-section less than a year ago. My mom and I were starting to have a relationship for the first time in my entire life, but drug addiction would soon ruin it for the millionth time. I was given pain medicine after having my baby, and I was terrified to take it because of what I've lived through. I only took it when I absolutely had to, but I was in so much pain. My mom had just been to visit, and I never thought to remove my pain medication because it was in my bedroom out of sight. The next day, I was lying in bed with my 2-week-old baby, and I was having terrible pains due to my incision. I reached to the end of the table for my pain medicine. When I opened the bottle, there was only 1 pill left. I'd had 8 pills when my mother came to visit. She took 7. My mom finally admitted to stealing my medicine, and I refused to talk to her for months. In November, I received a phone call from my sister telling me the neighbor called and my mom was having a heart attack. When the paramedics arrived, they couldn't find a pulse or temperature. They flew her to the closest town, and they had to shock her because her heart stopped. They found narcotics in her system, and I will forever believe that years of using drug is the reason for her heart attack. She spent a month in the hospital nursing home recovering. I believe she may be drug-free now, but I will never fully trust her. I can't. Each time I call and she doesn't answer, I picture her high somewhere stumbling around. I could give endless anecdotes and examples on how drug addiction ruined my life, but I don't think I can ever adequately describe what prescription drugs have robbed me of. The only thing worse than not having a mother at all is having a mother who chooses drugs over you. Something needs to be done in West Virginia, or the prescription drug abuse is only going to get worse. All addicts have to do is go to a pain clinic, fool the doctors to receive medication. I know too many people who have easy access to drugs because of corrupt doctors in the area and because the pain clinics are not effective. I can only pray that the problem is addressed and that my son doesn't have to grow up in an area so overtaken by drug abuse as I did. Sincerely, a drug addict's daughter, Haley. Mr. President, you have these same letters. You have these same circumstances you live with every day. If some of us don't rise up and say enough is enough and stop this abuse, it's going to be an epidemic that's going to consume this country. I go to schools every day and I speak to children as much as I possibly can. I tell them, there's not another country in the world that believes they can take on the United States of America, militarily or economically. We are the greatest nation. We are the hope of the world. Guess what? They don't believe they have to. They're going to sit back and watch. If we don't have education and we don't have skill sets because of lack of education attainment, and if we're addicted, we don't have a clean society, we're not going to be able to compete. We're not going to be the superpower. And this generation, we can't let this generation down, let it fail. I'm going to be coming here every chance I get to read letters from West Virginians to let you know of the epidemic that's going on, the ravishness that is happening in my state, and taking away precious lives, whether directly or indirectly, through a child or a parent. And I'm hoping that we can all change the FDA's direction. We can get somebody in there that'll change the culture of the FDA, that'll protect us and fight for us, and not for the business plan of pharmaceuticals. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor to my good friend from Nevada.